the imagination, which to this point has been a human faculty and the consolation of artists, is about to turn into real estate. As real as any real estate there is. And in a way, I think the shamans who, for the past 50,000 years, have been essentially, they leapt over the material phase of imagination engineering and went to nanotechnology 25, 30,000 years ago. By nanotechnology, I mean reliance on machines to achieve your goals, machines that are under 1 nanometer in size, smaller than a billionth of an inch. We don't think of drug molecules as machines, but in fact they are machines, and they perform their work in the synapse like machines. So shamanism didn't use matter to build its realities. It was more sophisticated than that. It directly addressed the capacity of the human mind in the presence of unusual neurochemicals to produce unusual phenomena and unusual sensoria of experience. Now, what's happening is these two strains of development, let's call it the pharmacological, nanotechnological, low-tech, natural, shamanic path, and the high-tech, material manipulating, macro-physical technologies are encountering each other and meeting in the domain of the modern computer. And this is fascinating. The world is becoming more and more defined by the imagination. And those of us who are involved in creating this, I think, have the feeling that it has in it a kind of built-in dynamic toward finality. In other words, this is not a process that can go on for hundreds of thousands or even hundreds of years, because the human imagination is so endlessly self-transcending. Whatever its most advanced creation of the moment is, it's in the process of obviating and denying it and seeking to go beyond it. And, I think it was Plato, I'm not sure he said it first, but said, if God does not exist, human beings will create God. Well, I think the truth is they're not even going to wait to find out. It's easier to cut to the technical solution and sort the whole thing out later. And if the God we make and the God we find are in conflict with each other, they'll just have to duke it out. Because, there's a wonderful phrase in Myths, Dreams, and Mysteries, a book by Merciliade, where he's talking about powered flight, of all things, the Wright brothers. And he says, whatever we make of this as an engineering feat, it speaks volumes about the human psyche's desire to transcend itself infinitely. And so, in a sense, the powered flight is a psychological breakthrough, because man flies. Well, then, spacecraft, we break beyond the embrace of gravity. And these technological breakthroughs are always presented in terms of overcoming some set of boundary constraints imposed by nature. And in virtual reality, all boundary constraints are overcome by nature, just as in the imagination. But the imagination, metabolically sustained, in other words, you eat well, then you smoke a lot of hash, then you enter into an imaginative reality. But as metabolism ebbs and flows, as your food digests, as the drugs leave your system, this reality, whatever it is, falls to pieces and is washed away. But the reality, the virtual realities created in code are more enduring. They are, in fact, as enduring as the code maker. And so we're beginning to talk in terms of dreams which don't go away, worlds of the imagination which one can work on for months, and then lead one's critics through and collect their critiques and make the corrections and dot the I's and cross the T's according to the way one's critics and friends think it should be done. And so what this means is somehow the imagination, always among the most private of domains, is like everything else under the impact of the new technologies, being redefined so that there is no private and public distinction anymore. So we are on the brink of losing, in a sense, a part of our individuality. We are going to be able to build hallucinations and then walk through them and discuss them and edit them and re-edit them. And to this point, we've been doing psychology sort of like a blind man polishing a Cadillac in total darkness. If you keep excellent notes and don't lose your place, you form a kind of a notion of what a Cadillac must be. But what we're about to do is just turn on the fluorescent lighting and look at the thing. And I don't know what this will bring. I think it will redefine us. We are a great mystery to ourselves and to each other, but not in principle, only through limitations imposed by the physical body and limitations of technology. And so I think, what our yearning for community, for collectivity, for telepathy, for universal human understanding is, in a sense, going to be self-fulfilled by simply opening up the imagination, not as a private dimension, but as a public and shared dimension. And this will be, I think, incredibly enriching and surprising. We are going to find out what the human critter really is and what we are really capable of. And I'm not afraid of this at all, because I think, basically I'm a Platonist. And Plato identified the good and the true and the beautiful as the same thing. But notice it's very hard to know what is good. And it's quite difficult, even more difficult, to know what is true. But it is intuitively understood what is beautiful. So beauty is the easy way in. Beauty leads to the good and the true. And we are on the brink, I think, of taking a stride toward beauty that is the greatest stride in that direction since the emergence of language in the human species. And the emergence of language in the human species was the first shoe dropping in this enterprise. And the building of virtual realities that can be shared and critiqued and understood is the dropping of the second shoe. A true civilization lives in its own imagination and lives through its imagination. And when this is an accessible possibility to most people, I think a great deal of our inhumanity will simply fall away from us, because it is not inherent. It is the product of misapprehension of each other's goals and intent and aesthetic. So I think that's about all I have to say about that tonight. I get spun into it and I can't stop. I don't know whether I'm talking to yourself or to you or to me, but this is some of what we'll talk about this weekend. This may be the longest single uninterrupted spiel you hear from me. As I said, these things are best driven when people inject their agenda into it. But these are the things I'm thinking about. History feels very risky to a lot of people. I think that it is risky, but it is because the stakes are so high. We really have an opportunity to transcend ourselves and to fulfill the human enterprise on this planet. And, I'm so aware of the limitations of the people of the past, their agonies, their concerns. I mean, how many children were born stillborn? How many women died in childbirth? 9 times in the last 5 million years, the glaciers have ground south from the poles, pushing everything in their path. Those people didn't drop the ball. The amount of human suffering and agony that has gone into carrying us to this moment of privilege and opportunity is incalculable and can only be redeemed if we bring this inherent human beauty into the world as spiritual food for ourselves and for the human community. Well, it's very interesting. I'm working on a book now. A lot of it is about the subject of language. It's a little hard to talk about it in English, because in English, the word language both means the general linguistic facility, and it also is heard as meaning speech. And as I looked into language and studied it, and studied what other people had said about it, there were some surprises. The first surprise is that the straight people in the field, what is taught in the academy, is that language is no more than 35,000 years old. This was astonishing to me. I just, for some reason, my own intellectual biases, assumed that the conservative academic position would be that spoken language is old, because it seems so basically a part of us. How can it have arrived 35,000 years ago? That makes it something as artificial as a bicycle pump or a transistor radio. Well, the problem here is that this word language is misheard in English. So in writing this new book, I had to make a very clear distinction. Language is old. Honeybees do it, dolphins do it. It's even possible, when you think of chemical communication, that flowers and ants do it. Nature is knit together by communication, which has rules, has syntax, and so is language. If you've ever stood in a rainforest or any species-dense environment, it's alive with signals, with sounds, with odors that are carrying messages. These things are not just produced for aesthetic effect. They have intended hearers and so forth and so on. And language in human beings is old, because we know that we evolved from pack-hunting primates, socialized primates, that had, as we observe the behavior of primates alive in the world today, very complex repertoires of signals. Signals which mean dive for cover, an eagle is cruising the area, or here is food enough for a dozen of us, and so forth. Complex pack signaling. What happened, and it was the greatest technological leap we've ever made, and in some ways the cleanest and the most astonishing. It's almost like a resonance. Remember last night I mentioned how strange it was that the largest buildings people ever built were the first buildings they ever built. Well, the greatest technological revolution so far ever launched by human beings was, in a sense, this early one. I won't call it the first, because there was tool making before that, there was fire before that, but somewhere in Africa, no less than 40,000 years ago, and this means a time when human beings who look like you and I, maybe a little pigmentation differential, but basically people exactly like you and I, had already radiated all over the planet. I mean, by 40,000 years ago, nobody argues that people weren't everywhere. Recent finds in Australia have pushed back the date of Aboriginal penetration into Australia to 120,000 years. And that's not woo-woo. That's Wollongong University Department of Archaeology stuff. 120,000 years. So people were all over the world. Well, did they communicate? They certainly did communicate. They communicated with dance, with gesture, and, leading back to your question, with music. They communicated in all kinds of ways. But we now know from the study of the introduction of media that if a medium of sufficient power and bandwidth is introduced into a population, it will abandon all previous forms of media in favor of this. We saw this in America after World War II, when a print literate society within a decade became a television society. We are seeing it now, where in the space of 5 years the internet goes from being say what to indispensable for huge numbers of people, and that's in the space of 5 years. Someone in Africa, probably loaded, experimenting with singing and chanting and sound, was lifted out of their plane. In other words, they actually had a breakthrough in the imagination. And they said, how would it be if, this amazing word, the power of if, how would it be if we decided that a certain sound is associated with a certain thing? And let's play a little game. Every time I make this sound, you think of this thing. And let's make a little list. Let's take 5 sounds and assign them to 5 common things. And now I'll make the sound, and you think the thing. Well, behind all this is the organizational architecture of the human organism, which onto a game such as that will effortlessly lay what is called syntax. And Chomsky and others have shown that what is called the rules of transformational grammar, or the deep structures of language, are genetic. All languages, in order to be intelligible, have to obey these rules. A language which does not obey these rules is not a language, is not intelligible. So through a breakthrough in imagination, a kind of stepping sideways from the by then old enterprise of entertaining each other with funny mouth noises, language was produced, probably, literally at a definable moment in space and time. a person, the mother or the father of all media, discovered utterance. And it was like an intellectual virus spreading through the population and moving as quickly as human beings could carry it, because it was a superior form of media. Before, communication had been, I imagine, highly slanted toward emotional states and time-bounded states. You go up to somebody, you take hold of them, you look at them, and they understand we're either going hunting or we're going to have sex, and it will be spelled out in just the next little while. That kind of thing. And this kind of communication was a sufficiently viscous social glue to hold small hunting-gathering groups together. As society complexifies and spreads out through space and time, it either loses its coherency or it evolves methods of communication to keep it in touch with itself. I am not a linguist. I read a lot of this linguistic literature without really understanding it. But I know that the people who give their lives to this believe that they can extrapolate the rules of spoken language of the Indo-European, of modern European languages, to reason backward toward a language that was spoken 12 to 10,000 years ago, called Indo-European or Proto-Indo-European. And this was thought to be the great achievement of linguistics as of 15 or 20 years ago. Now a new generation of people have pushed it further back. There is a language called Nostratic that was spoken on the Anatolian Plateau and across southern Europe 15 to 25,000 years ago. And now, people like Shavroshkin at Stanford, and this was all done by Russians, by the way. The Russians hold the high ground in linguistics. It was Russian insights that cracked the Mayan language, too. But Shavroshkin and his people are now talking about a language called Old World. And Old World is the first language ever spoken on this planet by higher primates. Beyond Old World, there is inarticulate silence. And Old World is a 35,000-year-old language. How can we know such things? You have to push into the linguistic literature, and you're a better man than I am, Gungadin. But there are websites you can go to where people speak in Old World, and you can hear what it sounded like. And sounds like a bunch of really primitive people.
How do we know that we've really evolved with this language?
Well, this is an interesting area. One of my sub-themes is novelty, and that supposedly reality becomes more novel as we approach the present. And this is certainly true of biology and many, many phenomena. But there is an important exception, so I'm told. I'm not yet entirely convinced of this, but convinced enough to pass it on. And that is, though this obviously contains a paradox, languages seem to be more complicated as you go back in time. Structurally and in number of words. So that, for instance, Old English is considerably richer in certain areas than modern English. Now, I say probably what's happening is that technical vocabularies are keeping the boat roughly at equilibrium. But, for every widget word, a word describing some subset of our technology, if we're losing words that indicate emotional nuances or nuances of rapport and understanding, then the language is being impoverished. Most scholars of English believe that, Shakespeare caught the wave. Shakespeare is not only a phenomenon of immense human genius focused in one person, but it's also a moment of incredible linguistic richness and opportunity that didn't exist 200 years before and didn't survive 200 years after.